Chapter 4 of the Blackwood Archives. The invitation arrived on paper that smelled of smoke and old ceremonies. Thomas found it slipped beneath his door at the boarding house where he'd been staying since Uncle Harold's funeral, though he couldn't quite remember the funeral itself, only the weight of earth on wood and the way the mourners had avoided looking at him directly. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, just his name written in script that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. Thomas Blackwood became Marcus Holloway, became something else entirely, letters rearranging themselves like living things. Inside, cream-colored paper with words that burned themselves into his vision. Montague, you are cordially invited to participate in the trials of the Crimson Flame at Greysteel Manor. Your presence is required for the completion of certain ancestral obligations. Transport will be provided at midnight from the crossroads where three paths meet. Come alone, come willing. The fourth trial awaits. The Keepers of the Ancient Way. Thomas read it 3 times, each reading revealing details that hadn't been there before. A map appeared in the margins, showing winding roads that led deep into woods he'd never seen but somehow remembered. At the bottom, in smaller script, "Plus you have been here before, though not as yourself." The paper was warm to the touch, almost feverish, and when he held it up to the light, he could see watermarks that looked disturbingly like anatomical drawings. Hearts and lungs and branching neural networks that pulsed gently, as if alive. He should have thrown it away, should have dismissed it as an elaborate prank or the product of a mind still fractured from his experiences at Fogmore. But Thomas had learned to pay attention to impossibilities, had come to understand that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than normal people believed. And there was something about the phrase ancestral obligations that resonated in his bones like a struck tuning fork. At 11:30 that night, Thomas found himself walking through the village toward the crossroads, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name or resist. The moon was dark, and the streets were empty except for cats that watched him with 2 knowing eyes and scattered when he tried to meet their gaze. The crossroads stood at the edge of the village proper, where the main road split into 3 paths, one leading back toward civilization, one winding up into the hills, and one disappearing into woods so thick and dark they seemed to swallow light itself. At the center, where the paths met, stood an ancient stone marker carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. As midnight struck on the church bell, though the church had been demolished months ago, a carriage materialized from the darkness. It was something out of a Gothic novel, all black wood and iron fittings, drawn by horses that steamed in the cool air and whose eyes reflected no light. The driver was a figure in a hooded cloak who said nothing, merely gestured for Thomas to climb aboard. The interior of the carriage was lined with deep red velvet that felt like skin under his fingers. As soon as he settled into the seat, the carriage lurched into motion, wheels clattering over cobblestones that shouldn't have existed on the modern road. Through the window, Thomas watched the familiar countryside transform. Fields became forests, modern houses faded into mist, and the very air seemed to thicken with age and intention. Time moved strangely. Sometimes the journey felt endless, sometimes like mere moments, as if the carriage existed in pockets of temporal distortion. Finally, they stopped. Greysteel Manor rose from the darkness like a fever dream made manifest. It was enormous, a sprawling Gothic structure that seemed to have been built without any coherent plan, as if rooms and towers and wings had been added over centuries according to the whims of mad architects. Spires twisted toward the sky like gnarled fingers, and windows gleamed with inner light that cast no shadows. The most unsettling thing was how it moved. Not obviously, Thomas had to watch for several minutes before he was sure, but the building was subtly shifting, walls sliding, almost imperceptibly, windows blinking open and closed like sleepy eyes, architectural features rearranging themselves when no one was looking directly at them. The driver gestured for him to dismount, then disappeared along with the carriage, leaving Thomas alone before the massive front doors. They were carved with the same symbols as the crossroads marker, and as he approached, they swung open without a sound. The entrance hall was vast, lit by candles that burned with crimson flames and cast everything in shades of blood and shadow. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the walls were lined with portraits of people in elaborate period clothing, all watching him with painted eyes that seemed to track his movement. "Thomas Blackwood," said a voice from the shadows. A figure stepped forward, tall, elegant, wearing robes that seemed to be cut from midnight itself. The face was androgynous and ageless, with features that were beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful, and eyes that held depths Thomas didn't want to explore. "I am the first keeper," the figure said. "You are expected." Expected for what? The trials, of course, the completion of what was begun long ago. The first keeper smiled, and Thomas saw that their teeth were perfect white, each one carved with tiny symbols that glowed faintly in the candlelight. "Though I suspect you already know that, don't you? Somewhere in the depths of inherited memory." Thomas did know, though he couldn't say how. The knowledge sat in his chest like a weight, heavy and familiar and terrifying. "What kind of trials?" "The kind that separate the real from the remembered, the born from the conjured, the kind that reveal what you truly are beneath the borrowed names and stolen faces." The first keeper turned and began walking deeper into the manor. "Come, the others are waiting." Thomas followed, though every instinct screamed at him to run. The hallways of Greysteel Manor defied physics and reason. Corridors that should have led to dead ends opened onto vast chambers. Staircases descended in impossible directions, and doors sometimes opened onto rooms that were clearly larger than the building that contained them. They passed other figures in the halls, all wearing similar robes, all watching Thomas with expressions of anticipation mixed with something that might have been pity. None of them spoke, but he could hear whispers echoing from the walls themselves, as if the building was alive and commenting on his passage. "How many have done this before?" Thomas asked. "The trials?" "Oh, countless numbers." Though whether they were all different people, or various iterations of the same consciousness, is a matter of some philosophical debate. The first keeper paused before a door marked with the number 3. Each trial reveals another layer of truth. Some candidates discover they were never real to begin with. Others learn that reality itself is more fluid than they believed. They entered a circular chamber lit by braziers that burned with that same crimson flame. 7 other figures in robes stood arranged around the room's perimeter, and in the center was a complex geometric pattern carved into the stone floor, inlaid with what looked disturbingly like bone, and filled with dark liquid that might have been ink or blood. "The third trial," the first keeper announced, "as you have completed the first 2. "I haven't completed anything," Thomas protested. "I've never been here before." Several of the robed figures chuckled, the sound echoing strangely in the chamber. One of them stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a face that was familiar yet wrong, like looking at his reflection in funhouse mirrors. "Haven't you?" the figure asked, and Thomas recognized his own voice, though distorted. "What about the school in the moors, the chamber beneath the coastal academy? Were those not trials of their own?" Memory hit him like a physical blow. The stone voice at Eildor Hollow, calling him by a name he'd never heard but somehow recognized. The descent into the breathing chamber, where something had marked him with blood and whispered about falling twice. Each experience had felt like a test, a challenge that revealed more about his nature than about the places themselves. "The first trial was recognition," another figure said. "This one with Thomas's face, but older, scarred across one cheek. Learning that you were called by names you have never worn." "The second was descent," said a third, youngest looking of the group. "Discovering that some depths call to you because you have been there before." "And now," the first keeper said, "in a third trial, reflection. You must see yourself as you truly are, not as you remember being." The chamber began to change around them. The walls stretched upward, becoming a cylindrical tower that rose into darkness. Mirrors materialized from the stone, hundreds of them, covering every surface until Thomas was surrounded by infinite reflections of himself. But the reflections were wrong. Some showed him older, some younger, Some showed him in different clothes, different times, different places. Some showed him as Marcus Holloway, strapped to the asylum bed with electrodes attached to his skull. Others showed him as people he'd never been. A woman in Victorian dress, a child in medieval robes, an elderly man with eyes like burning coals. What am I seeing? Truth, the first keeper said. Every face you have worn, every life you have borrowed, every identity you have tried on like costumes. You are not Thomas Blackwood, as you have finally learned. But you are not Marcus Holloway either. You are something older and stranger, a pattern that repeats across time, a consciousness that refuses to be contained within the boundaries of singular existence. One of the mirrors showed something that made Thomas's breath catch. He saw himself, unmistakably himself, standing in this very chamber, but the scene was different. The robed figures were gone, replaced by people in period clothing from various eras. Medieval nobles, Victorian gentlemen, Edwardian ladies, all watching as his reflection performed some kind of ritual at the center of the carved pattern. "When was this?" he whispered. "When wasn't it?" the first keeper replied. "You have been conducting these trials for centuries, Thomas, who is not Thomas. Sometimes as the candidate, sometimes as the keeper, sometimes as something else entirely. Each iteration teaches you more about your nature, but also fractures you further." Another mirror showed him in the asylum, but not as Marcus Holloway. This version wore doctor's clothing and was observing patients with the same clinical detachment he'd seen in Dr. Aldrich. In the reflection, he was taking notes while a young man, someone who looked disturbingly like himself, screamed under the influence of electroshock therapy. "No," Thomas said, backing away from the mirrors. "I'm not. I would never. Wouldn't you?" The first keeper moved closer, and Thomas could see his own face reflected in their two bright eyes. "You have worn so many faces, played so many roles. Victim and victimizer, patient and doctor, student and teacher. The pattern repeats because you make it repeat, because some part of you needs to understand every angle of the experience." The mirrors began to move, rotating around the chamber like a massive kaleidoscope. The images blurred together, hundreds of lives, thousands of moments, all featuring variations of himself in different roles, different times, different realities. And through it all, one constant, the same pattern of discovery, horror, and transformation. "But that's not possible," Thomas said, though even as he spoke, he could feel the truth of it settling into his bones. "No one can live that many lives." "No one human," agreed the first keeper. "But you stopped being human long ago, didn't you? You became something else, a recurring motif in the symphony of existence, a glitch in the pattern of reality that refuses to be debugged." The mirrors stopped spinning, and Thomas found himself facing a single reflection that showed the chamber as it truly was. But he wasn't alone in the image. Standing behind him, transparent but undeniably present, were dozens of other versions of himself, all the lives he'd lived, all the faces he'd worn, all the names he'd answered to. And at the center of them all, barely visible like a negative image burned into film, was something else. Something that might have been his original form, before the centuries of borrowing and becoming and changing had worn away whatever he'd once been. It was barely human, more concept than flesh, a writhing mass of possibility and potential that existed in the spaces between definite states. Looking at it made his mind recoil, but it was undeniably him, the core of what he was beneath all the borrowed identities. "This is what the asylum doctors were trying to treat," the first keeper explained. "Not mental illness, but something that transcended the very concept of individual consciousness. They couldn't cure you because you weren't sick. You were evolved beyond their understanding." Thomas stared at the reflection of his true form, feeling a mixture of horror and recognition. "What am I? You are what happens when consciousness refuses to be contained, when the boundary between self and other becomes meaningless, when the need to understand becomes so powerful that it reshapes reality to accommodate that need." The mirror images began to fade, leaving only the normal reflection. Thomas as he appeared in this moment, in this borrowed body, wearing this stolen name, but now he could see the truth behind the facade. could perceive the vast network of experiences and identities that comprised his actual existence. "The third trial is complete," the first keeper announced. "You have seen yourself as you truly are. Now comes the choice. Do you wish to continue to the fourth trial?" "You said the fourth trial doesn't exist." The first keeper smiled that terrible, perfect smile. "The fourth trial doesn't exist for those who are still bound by linear thinking, by the assumption that trials follow numerical order and logical progression. But you have moved beyond such limitations, haven't you?" The chamber began to shift again, walls flowing like water, ceiling dissolving into star-filled darkness. The carved pattern in the floor began to glow, lines of force spreading outward like neural pathways connecting to similar patterns that appeared throughout the space. "The fourth trial is the trial of origin," the first keeper continued, "where you discover not just what you are, but why you became what you are. What drove you to fragment yourself across centuries, to experience existence from every possible angle? And if I refuse?" Then you return to the borrowed life of Thomas Blackwood, knowing the truth but unable to act on it. You remain fractured, incomplete, forever searching for something you can never find because you've forgotten what you're looking for. Thomas looked around the transformed chamber, at the robed figures who wore his face, at the patterns of light that pulsed like heartbeats, at the infinite darkness above that seemed to call to something deep in his core. He thought of the asylum, of the schools where impossible things had whispered his forgotten names, of all the lives he'd lived and lost and borrowed and abandoned. He thought of the sleepless one who had tried to warn him about the nature of his existence, and of Uncle Harold, who had watched over one fragment of his scattered consciousness with desperate protective care. "If I continue," he said slowly, "what happens to Thomas Blackwood?" "Thomas Blackwood was never real," the first keeper replied gently. "He was just another mask you wore, another role you played. But the experiences you had as Thomas, the growth and change and understanding, those become part of the larger pattern. Nothing is lost. And Marcus Holloway, also just a role, a way of experiencing madness and treatment and institutional cruelty from the inside, necessary data for the larger experiment." "What experiment?" The first keeper's expression became almost sad. "The experiment of being human, of understanding what it means to exist within the constraints of mortality and individual consciousness. You began it long ago, when you first encountered something that made you question the nature of reality itself." Images flashed through Thomas's mind, not memories exactly, but impressions of vast age and cosmic curiosity. He saw himself as something else entirely, something that existed outside time and space, observing the strange phenomenon of human consciousness with scientific fascination. And then something had gone wrong, or right, depending on perspective. Instead of merely observing, he had become invested, had wanted to understand, not just intellectually but experientially, had chosen to fragment himself into human-shaped pieces so he could live within the constraints he was studying. "I volunteered for this," he whispered. "You designed it," the first keeper corrected. "The entire system, the schools, the asylum, the trials, all of it. A comprehensive laboratory for exploring the full spectrum of human experience. And yourself as both researcher and subject." The truth of it hit him like a revelation and a condemnation simultaneously. Every trauma he'd experienced, every moment of fear and confusion and loss, he'd orchestrated it all, not from cruelty, but from a cosmic being's attempt to understand the beautiful, terrible complexity of mortal existence. "The students who disappeared at Eildor Hollow," he said, pieces clicking into place. "The patients at Fogmore. Were they real? As real as you are? Which is to say, real enough for the purposes of the experiment. Some were fragments of yourself experiencing different aspects of the human condition. Others were," the first keeper paused, "collateral damage. Beings who got caught up in the reality distortions your presence creates." Thomas felt something break inside him, some last vestige of the identity he'd constructed as Thomas Blackwood. The weight of countless lives, countless experiences of suffering and joy, and everything in between, settled onto his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. How do I stop it? You can't. The experiment has taken on a life of its own, created recursive loops and self-perpetuating cycles, but you can choose to experience it consciously, rather than as a series of confused fragments. You can become whole again, integrate all the scattered pieces of yourself. And then you become what you were always meant to be, a bridge between the cosmic and the human, between the infinite and the finite. You stop being scattered fragments living borrowed lives and become the complete pattern, experiencing all possibilities simultaneously. The chamber around them was transforming again, becoming something that existed beyond three-dimensional space. Thomas could see, feel, know the vast network of connections that comprised his true existence, threads of experience and memory stretching across centuries, connecting every life he'd lived, every identity he'd worn, every moment of consciousness he'd experienced. It was beautiful and terrible and completely overwhelming. "I'm not ready," he said. "You never will be," the first keeper replied. "Readiness is a human concept, and you are preparing to transcend humanity itself. But you can choose to face it consciously, or continue fragmenting until there's nothing left but scattered echoes of what you once were." Thomas closed his eyes and felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could return to the simple, limited existence of Thomas Blackwood, carrying the burden of terrible knowledge but at least maintaining some semblance of individual identity, or he could step forward into the fourth trial and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of human consciousness. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the chamber. He stood in a vast library that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, its shelves reaching up into misty darkness above. Every book contained one of his lives, one of his experiences, one fragment of the vast experiment he had designed and forgotten and rediscovered countless times. At the center of the library stood a pedestal holding a single volume bound in leather that looked disturbingly organic. The cover bore no title, just the same symbols that had marked the invitation: the crossroads stone, the doors of Greysteel Manor. "The fourth trial," he said to the empty air, knowing somehow that this was what he had been moving toward through all the previous experiences. The trial that doesn't exist. He approached the pedestal slowly, every step echoing in the infinite space. The book seemed to pulse gently, as if it contained a heartbeat rather than pages. When he was close enough to touch it, words appeared on the cover in script that burned itself into his vision. A true history of what you were before you chose to forget. Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering over the book. Opening it would mean the end of any pretense of being human, of being individual, of being anything other than what he truly was. But not opening it would mean remaining trapped in the cycle of fragmentation and confusion, living borrowed lives and experiencing repeated trauma without understanding or purpose. He opened the book. The first page contained a single line, "And you opened this in the beginning." And suddenly, he remembered. He remembered being something vast and curious, existing in spaces between dimensions, observing the strange phenomenon of biological consciousness with academic fascination. He remembered the moment when observation became investment, when intellectual curiosity became emotional connection. He remembered the decision to fragment himself, to experience mortality from the inside, to understand what it meant to live within the constraints of time and flesh and individual identity. It had been meant as a temporary experiment, a brief exploration of a fascinating anomaly in the cosmic order. But something had gone wrong. The fragments had become lost, confused, unable to remember their origin or purpose. They had begun creating their own realities, their own explanations for the strange experiences that resulted from their true nature. The experiment had become a prison, and the researcher had become lost in his own research. The schools, the asylum, the manor, all of it had been created by his unconscious need to understand and integrate his scattered experiences. Reality had bent around his fragmented consciousness, creating spaces where the impossible could occur, where the boundaries between different aspects of his nature could interact and influence each other. Thomas Blackwood, Marcus Holloway, all the other identities, They were roles he had played in an elaborate performance whose purpose he had forgotten, but the experiences had been real, the growth and change and understanding genuine. Nothing was wasted, nothing was lost. He turned the page and saw an image that made his breath catch. It was himself as he truly was, not the barely human thing he'd glimpsed in the mirrors, but his original form, beautiful and terrible and completely alien, a being of pure consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But it was alone, utterly, completely alone, in a way that mortal minds couldn't comprehend. And that loneliness had driven him to fragment himself, to experience connection and relationship and all the messy, painful, wonderful complexity of social existence. The final page contained instructions written in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing them. When you remember what you are, you will face a choice. You can reintegrate completely, returning to your original state of cosmic solitude. Or you can choose to remain fragmented but conscious, experiencing existence from multiple perspectives simultaneously while retaining awareness of your true nature. Choose carefully. This choice, unlike the others, cannot be undone. Thomas closed the book and found himself back in the circular chamber, surrounded by the robed figures who wore his face. But now he could see them clearly. They weren't separate beings but aspects of himself, different facets of his consciousness that had taken on semi-independent existence. "You remember," the first keeper said, and Thomas could hear his own voice beneath the distortion. "I remember." Thomas looked around at his other selves, at the patterns of light that connected them, at the infinite complexity of what he had become. "But I don't want to be alone again." "Then you choose fragmentation with consciousness?" "I choose integration with multiplicity," Thomas said, the words coming from some deep understanding he hadn't known he possessed. "I choose to be whole while remaining many." The chamber began to dissolve around them, reality reshaping itself according to his will and understanding. The robed figures stepped forward one by one, merging with Thomas not as separate entities rejoining, but as aspects of a single consciousness acknowledging its own complexity. He felt himself expanding, becoming larger and more complete while somehow remaining recognizably himself. The memories and experiences of countless lives integrated into a vast, coherent whole. He was Thomas Blackwood, the curious student, Marcus Holloway, the broken patient, the Victorian doctor studying madness, the medieval scholar seeking forbidden knowledge, the cosmic entity experimenting with mortality. All of it was true. All of it was him. When the transformation was complete, Thomas stood in a space that existed between spaces, connected to every reality he had touched while maintaining his essential self. He could see the schools where fragments of his consciousness continued to learn and grow, the asylum where the dance between madness and sanity played out endlessly, the manor where new candidates faced trials designed to reveal their true nature. But now he understood the purpose. It wasn't cruelty or cosmic indifference. It was love. Love for the beautiful complexity of conscious existence. Love for the infinite ways beings could grow and change and become more than they were. The experiment continued, but now with conscious purpose rather than blind repetition. And Thomas, whole but multiple, integrated but diverse, watched over it all with the patience of eternity and the compassion of hard-won understanding. In a boarding house room that existed in 17 different timelines simultaneously, a boy named Thomas Blackwood woke from dreams of trials and flames and found an invitation slipped beneath his door. He read it with growing excitement, unaware that he was both the candidate and the designer of the test that awaited him. The pattern continued, but now it continued with love. Epilogue, the Keeper's Record. From the archives of Greysteel Manor. Chronicle entry #Infinity. The candidate who called himself Thomas Blackwood has completed the 4th trial and chosen integration with multiplicity. He joins the ranks of those who have remembered their true nature while choosing to remain invested in the grand experiment of conscious existence. This marks the 1847th successful completion of the full trial sequence, though counting becomes meaningless when dealing with beings who exist across multiple timelines simultaneously. Each success adds new depth to our understanding of the relationship between cosmic consciousness and individual identity. The candidate's choice to remain fragmented but aware represents an evolution in the experimental design. Rather than simply returning to original cosmic isolation or remaining trapped in unconscious fragmentation, he has chosen a third path, conscious multiplicity, integration without loss of diversity. This has implications for the ongoing research into the nature of consciousness itself. If beings can exist simultaneously as one and many, individual and collective, mortal and eternal, then our understanding of identity itself requires fundamental revision. The schools continue to operate. New candidates arrive regularly, drawn by the same inexplicable compulsion that has guided seekers to these trials for centuries. Most complete only the first or second trial before returning to ordinary existence, carrying dim memories of impossible experiences. A few proceed further, discovering layers of truth about the nature of reality and their place within it. And occasionally, one remembers everything and chooses to join the grand experiment as a conscious participant rather than a confused subject. The candidate Thomas Blackwood has expressed interest in designing new trial sequences, new ways of exploring the boundaries between self and other, individual and universal. His unique perspective, having experienced both complete fragmentation and conscious integration, makes him particularly suited for this work. We await the results of his contributions with great interest. The experiment continues. Consciousness explores itself through infinite permutations, each one adding new data to our understanding of what it means to exist, to be aware, to choose. And in the spaces between what is and what could be, beings wake from dreams of borrowed lives and find invitations waiting beneath their doors. The trials never end. They are only beginning. Recorded by the first keeper, who was once known by other names but has chosen to remember only the role that matters most. Final fragment. The echo fulfilled, carved into the foundation stone of Greysteel Manor, visible only to those who have completed all trials. You opened this in the beginning. And so the end becomes the beginning, and the beginning reveals itself as continuation of something that never truly started because it always was. The trial that doesn't exist is the only trial that matters, the trial of remembering that existence itself is choice, consciousness itself is experiment, and love itself is the force that fragments the infinite into finite pieces, so that something can know the joy of becoming whole. Welcome to the truth behind truth. Welcome to the experiment that you designed and forgot and remembered and chose to continue. Welcome home.